Imagine standing in a bakery line in Berlin in 1923. You have been waiting for hours, clutching a leather suitcase packed tight with thick bundles of paper. When you finally reach the counter, the price of a single loaf of bread has changed 3 times since you left your house that morning. You empty the suitcase onto the counter. The baker doesn't bother to count the notes. He weighs them on a scale. It is not enough. You turn away, your life savings now worth less than the ink used to print them. While across the street, a child builds a castle out of stacks of billion-mark notes because they are cheaper than wooden blocks. This was the reality of the Weimar Republic, a time when the very concept of money dissolved into thin air. Today, we are diving into the most infamous case of hyperinflation in modern history, a story of printing presses running red hot, a nation brought to its knees, and the terrifying lesson that when trust in a currency dies, everything else follows. To understand how a developed industrial powerhouse like Germany descended into this madness, we have to look at the wreckage of the First World War. When the war began in 1914, the German Empire made a fatal decision. Instead of raising taxes to fund their massive war effort, they decided to borrow. They were convinced that a swift victory would allow them to annex territory and force the defeated nations to pay for the entire conflict. They essentially bet the farm on a winning hand that never arrived. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, Germany was not just physically exhausted, it was financially hollowed out. The debt was staggering, but the Treaty of Versailles added a weight that would prove impossible to bear. The Allied powers demanded reparations, massive payments in gold, coal, and foreign currency, intended to keep Germany weak. The German government, now a fragile new democracy known as the Weimar Republic, found itself in a vice. They had to pay the reparations, support millions of war widows and wounded veterans, and rebuild an economy shattered by 4 years of total war. Their solution was simple, seductive, and ultimately catastrophic. They started the printing presses. At first, it seemed like a clever trick. If you don't have enough money, just make more. But money is not wealth. Wealth is the goods and services a country produces. When you flood an economy with paper money without a corresponding increase in the goods available to buy, you aren't creating prosperity. You are diluting the value of every single mark already in existence. At the start of 1922, the US dollar was worth about 190 marks. By December of that year, it took 7,000 marks to buy $1. But the true nightmare was only just beginning. In January 1923, the situation reached a breaking point. Germany defaulted on its coal deliveries to France. In response, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, intending to seize resources by force. The German government called for passive resistance. They told the workers in the Ruhr to stop working, to down tools, and to refuse to cooperate with the occupiers. To keep these workers and their families alive, the government promised to pay their wages. But with the factories shuttered, there was zero tax revenue coming in. With no gold reserves and no credit, the government did the only thing it knew how to do. It printed money to pay the strikers. This was the spark that turned a manageable inflation into a runaway inferno. The supply of money exploded, and as it did, the value of the mark began to evaporate in real time. Prices didn't just rise, they sprinted. A cup of coffee that cost 5,000 marks in the morning could cost 8,000 by the afternoon. People were paid twice a day, and they were given breaks to run to the shops to spend their wages before the money lost its value by sunset. The social fabric of the nation began to tear. The middle class, the traditional backbone of German society, was decimated. Imagine a lifetime of hard work, of saving diligently for a pension, of putting money into bonds or a savings account. In a matter of months, that lifetime of prudence was erased. A man who had saved enough to buy a house in 1914 found that his entire fortune could no longer buy a single newspaper. Meanwhile, those who had taken on massive debt found themselves in a strange position. If you had borrowed 1,000,000 marks to buy a farm, you could pay off that entire debt with the equivalent of a loaf of bread. Debtors became rich overnight, while savers were plunged into poverty. The psychological toll was even worse than the economic one. When money loses its meaning, the social contract begins to fray. People stopped trusting the government. They stopped trusting the law, and they stopped trusting each other. Bartering became the standard. A doctor might accept a chicken for a surgery. A landlord might accept a sack of potatoes for rent. The dignity of a civilized society was replaced by the chaotic, desperate scramble of a survivalist state. There were stories of people who would leave a suitcase of money in a parked car, only to return and find that someone had stolen the suitcase, but left the money because it was worthless. The denominations of the banknotes became absurd. The Reichsbank began printing notes in the millions, then the billions, then the trillions. They would take existing notes and simply stamp them with a higher value, because printing new ones couldn't keep up with the pace of the inflation. It was a surreal, dark comedy of errors played out on a national stage. The government, desperate to stabilize the situation, eventually appointed a new currency commissioner, Hjalmar Schacht. He realized that the only way to stop the madness was to kill the old currency entirely. In November 1923, they introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed by a mortgage on all the land and industrial assets of Germany. It was a psychological trick, but it worked. The German people, exhausted and terrified, chose to believe in the new money. The printing of the old mark ceased, and the hyperinflation was brought to a sudden, jarring halt. But the damage was already done. The Weimar Republic had survived, but it was a scarred, cynical, and unstable entity. The middle class had lost their faith in democracy and the capitalist system. They had seen their world collapse, and they were looking for someone to blame. They were looking for a savior, someone who promised strength, order, and a return to the glory days before the chaos. The hyperinflation didn't cause the rise of the Nazis directly, but it created the perfect vacuum for them. It taught a generation of Germans that the system was rigged, that the elites were incompetent, and that the only way to fix a broken nation was through radical authoritarian intervention. When we look back at the Weimar hyperinflation, we aren't just looking at a historical curiosity about wheelbarrows of cash. We are looking at a fundamental warning about the nature of money. Money is not just metal or paper. It is a manifestation of public trust. It is a shared belief that the piece of paper in your pocket will be worth something tomorrow. When that trust is breached, when a government uses the printing press to solve its own failures, the result is never just a rise in prices. It is the destruction of the social order. Today, we live in a world of digital currencies and central bank interventions, and it is easy to think that we have outgrown the mistakes of the past. We think that modern technology and sophisticated economic models have made us immune to the old traps. But the fundamental mechanics remain the same. When the money supply detaches from the reality of production, the value of that money must eventually correct itself. The laws of economics are as unforgiving as the laws of physics. As you walk through your day, buying your coffee or paying for your groceries, it is worth remembering the ghost of 1923. That year proved that the distance between a stable, thriving society and total economic collapse is much shorter than we like to think. It only takes a loss of trust, a series of bad political decisions, and the reckless use of the printing press to turn the currency of a great nation into nothing more than scrap paper. The tragedy of Weimar is that it was entirely avoidable. It was a choice. It was the result of leaders who prioritized short-term survival over long-term stability. And while history rarely repeats itself exactly, it certainly rhymes. The lessons of those wheelbarrows full of cash are as relevant today as they were 100 years ago. It serves as a reminder to every citizen, every investor, and every policymaker. Guard the stability of your currency as if your society depends on it, because in the end, it really does. As the dust settled on the German economy in late 1923, the country entered a brief period of relative stability known as the Golden Twenties. There was jazz, there was art, and there was a sense of relief. But the trauma of the hyperinflation remained in the collective subconscious. It was a deep, unhealed wound. When the Great Depression hit a few years later, the fear of returning to those dark days of 1923 paralyzed the government, leading to further disastrous policy choices. It is a stark reminder that economic trauma doesn't just disappear when the numbers stabilize. It lingers in the culture, shaping the politics and the future of a nation for decades to come. We often think of history as a collection of dates and battles, but the most powerful history is the history of everyday life. It is the history of the baker, the teacher, the soldier, and the mother trying to feed her children. It is the story of what happens when the foundation of their daily life, their money, is pulled out from under them. The Weimar hyperinflation remains the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when a government loses control of its currency and, by extension, loses the trust of its people. It is a story of how quickly the world can turn upside down and why, in the world of economics, trust is the most precious commodity of all. So the next time you hear about central banks, inflation rates, or monetary policy, don't just see the numbers. Think of the wheelbarrows. Think of the suitcases. Think of the people who watch their life's work turn to dust. And realize that the stability we enjoy today is a fragile thing, built on the hard-learned lessons of the past. It is a system that requires constant vigilance, because as the people of Weimar learned the hard way, when the money dies, the dream dies with it. The story of the Weimar hyperinflation is not just about Germany. It is a mirror held up to every economy in the world. It asks us a simple, terrifying question: how much is your trust worth? And what happens when that trust is gone? We have explored the rise, the madness, and the collapse, but the most important part of this story is the takeaway. It is a reminder that prosperity is not guaranteed, and that the integrity of our financial systems is the bedrock of our freedom. As we continue to navigate the complexities of the modern global economy, let us keep the ghost of the Weimar Republic in mind. Let us remember that the value of our money is the value of our society, and that we must always strive to protect both. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in economic history. We hope this look at the Weimar hyperinflation has given you a new perspective on the power and the fragility of the currency we use every single day. If you found this story compelling, make sure to look at the other videos on our channel where we break down the economic forces that shape our world. We believe that by understanding the past, we can better prepare for the future. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will see you in the next episode of Economic Nation.